Okay, everyone, welcome to this month's Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship Network webinar. We have our partners on the line who will present in a second, but I wanted to introduce those of us at New America. And we wanted to thank you for joining us today. This month is the month of January's monthly network learning opportunity. This will occur once a month for all of our network members, and there'll be a combination of webinars, office hours, or other technical assistance opportunities that we provide to you in partnership with all of our PAYA partners. Typically this occurs on the third Thursday of every month at 1 p.m. We had to move this one around, so thank you for being flexible with your schedules and taking the time to join us. We're excited to have our partners at ESG on the line to present about their work. And as just a refresher, in case you are not familiar, PAYA, the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship, we are an initiative housed here at New America to advance youth apprenticeship in cities and states across the country, and we do that in conjunction with our amazing partners, one of whom is ESG, the Education Strategy Group, and they released a report last year, at the end of last year, about the role of intermediaries, and they did this as a PAYA partner, and we're happy to provide that resource to you and also give them the chance to share with you some of their findings and the results of this report that you can go and read yourself on their website whenever you want. So with that, I will hand it over to Lauren and Ryan from ESG, who will do a deeper dive into this report for you, and then hand it back over to those of us at New America to give you some updates as PAYA network members.
Excellent. Thanks, Joyce. Welcome, everyone. Afternoon. This is Ryan Reyna from Education Strategy Group. For those that don't know us, we are a mission-based consulting firm that works to advance alignment across K-12, higher ed, and workforce. And specifically, we're working in a number of localities and states, really trying to scale high-quality career pathways for students that include a deep focus on high-quality work-based learning, and believe that youth apprenticeship offers one of the clearest ways to ensure that there's connections and transition opportunities for students from high school into higher education and on to the workforce. So we're really excited about the partnership and excited about this conversation, which is based on a series of interviews as well as our prior experience in working in those communities and states in helping to think about the role that intermediary organizations can play in bridging the gap between education and employers. So we're gonna talk today about the report that we released in October, as Joyce mentioned, which is available on the PAYA site as well as on ESG's site, as well as we're really interested in hearing from you at the end about questions or challenges that you may be facing as an intermediary yourself or in looking for intermediaries to help scale your work around youth apprenticeship and opportunities to provide ongoing assistance in that space. So intermediaries, really, in our view, there we go. All right, we're good. Sorry about that. As you guys all know, and given that you're living this experience in your daily lives right now, for work-based learning, high quality work-based learning of any kind, but especially for youth apprenticeship, to take off and really be successful, employers and educators have to be both at the table, and there has to be really someone that's helping to navigate and connect them. As we have seen in our work, unfortunately, far too often the two sectors have really clear formal opportunities to connect and collaborate. And many times the engagement, if there is any engagement that occurs, is between a single high school or a single district and an employer, rather than as a broader network or regional or even statewide approach. So even when those relationships do exist, it can often be difficult to launch youth apprenticeship and work-based learning generally opportunities at scale. And we know that in that work, in particular, one of the hardest things to do is, even when relationships have been started, is to really be able to maintain them and sustain them over time as people and administrations and politics change. So when neither employers nor school systems have the capacity needed to manage work-based learning, in addition to covering their core services, oftentimes they look for outside help to ensure that there's a way to fill this gap. And so we thought it was important to really dig into and better understand the way in which these intermediary organizations serve as a go-between and a common point of contact. So while intermediary organizations often are standalone, some are situated in different organizations in the education or workforce sector, be those in community college systems, chambers of commerce, other large organizations. And in our engagement and as this PAYA network demonstrates, there is quite a diversity in terms of the scale of work that these organizations provide. Some are tasked with running local programs, others operate regionally or statewide. And in fact, there are a number of intermediaries, including some of whom we talked to, that are actually multi-state initiatives. Despite the scale and size of the work, at the end of the day, they're all trying to serve a common mission, and that's to convene or connect traditionally disconnected stakeholders. And we sort of see them as force multipliers in doing that. In trying to learn more and gather kind of evidence around the types of roles that intermediaries can play in scaling high quality youth apprenticeship, we thought it would be important to interview a series of organizations that currently operate as youth apprenticeship intermediaries and or have recently gotten into that space, to really understand their needs, to understand the roles they play and the challenges that they face. So we conducted interviews with about a dozen established intermediaries across a kind of diverse geographic scope, service scale, the type of work-based learning that they offer, whether exclusively youth apprenticeship or more. And we were really trying to discover the types of roles and services that are common across work-based learning intermediaries, what in particular is unique about youth apprenticeship and the specific needs and challenges that those organizations face. And then how do the organizations work to actually scale work-based learning broadly and youth apprenticeship in particular. The other thing I would note here is that while all of the organizations we talked to themselves served as a direct intermediary for connecting students and employers, many of them also served in a sort of secondary role, which is a kind of a meta role, and that is the intermediary of intermediaries. So that this notion that in some places the organization itself is a network of other organizations that serve in individual roles. So it's an important consideration, and one that I think needs to be kind of dug into further. We're not going to talk a lot about it on this particular presentation, but it's something that I know is in existence in some of the partners in the PAYA network. So we're excited and interested to learn more about how those types of organizations can connect multiple partners. What we found is a series of services that were offered across the work-based learning spectrum with a specific focus in youth apprenticeship. And the services kind of serve three different roles. One is for employers in the way in which these organizations can help with the engagement and relationship management and the direct support for individuals that are offering spots for students. The second is in connecting with education institutions, often high schools, but very often also higher education institutions, in terms of actually mapping the way in which the work that students are doing in school connects to the work that they're doing out of school. and the opportunities for earning high school and post-secondary credit, as well as for engaging and sort of recruiting students at the end of the day into the positions. And then finally, that direct to youth connection point, which by and large really was focused on a sort of case management perspective in terms of determining student interest, student need, and matching that with employer opportunity. At the same time, there were some cross-cutting functions that we found that each of the organizations served regardless of the kind of focus group or area of interest that they facilitated and navigated their work around. And those were sort of setting clear expectations and accountability for the work and sort of data collection and management and things of that nature. The second was generally administrative oversight, which got to a lot of the behind the scenes paperwork and making sure articulation happened and that individual students were getting appropriate credit and schools were able to offer and recognize that credit. And then finally, and I think importantly for this conversation, the role that each of them played in communicating and marketing about the importance and value of youth apprenticeship generally, both in terms of the return on investment that it can provide for employers, while also the sort of opportunity that it opens doors for individual students, and communicating that to both students and parents about why youth apprenticeship is something that they should be engaged in and how it can help advance them as they progress through education and into the workforce. So Lauren is gonna talk through each of these different roles and give a little bit more of a flavor of how we saw these organizations playing in those roles. And then I'm gonna close out at the end talking a little bit more about some of the concerns and challenges around scaling and starting new intermediaries. So I'll kick it over to Lauren now.
Thanks, Ryan. So if we start with services that intermediaries tend to serve for employers, we identified 5 key roles. The first is student recruitment and matching. So for employers, the foremost role of an intermediary is to connect them with potential work-based learning participants or with students. But we found this can be a really daunting role for employers to take on themselves, as there's rarely a single obvious point of contact for engaging with schools and students. As Ryan mentioned before, most schools have one single point of contact, whether that's a teacher or a counselor, that is individually matching students with opportunities. So employers may work with intermediaries to post youth-appropriate job descriptions. They may also connect employers with a pool of applicants in, for example, an online portal. The second is relationship management. So once employers sign on to host a work-based learning experience, intermediaries can help them to maintain relationships with all of their various partners, whether that's education institutions, other employers, etc. This kind of serves 2 functions. The first is maintaining satisfaction with those partners, but ultimately improving retention and ensuring that those partnerships are able to be sustained over time. So some intermediaries may also offer employers membership if they have kind of a broader professional community that they're able to connect employers through. Next, intermediaries also provide employer record coverage. This is particularly important for fields that have strict safety guidelines. That might be manufacturing or health services, where some of those employers may be unable or unwilling to consider work-based learning opportunities for the liability issues that arise from working with minors. So several of the intermediaries that we interviewed overcame this hurdle by assuming responsibility for students' liability by serving as the official employer of record. So in addition to holding that kind of liability responsibility, intermediaries may also conduct any necessary applicant background checks or drug screenings on behalf of employers. We also saw a few intermediaries that also took on the responsibility for handling payroll, though we do want to note that some work-based learning programs actually require employers to handle that themselves. Next is supervisor selection and training. As you can imagine, supervising youth who may not have had a professional experience prior to starting a work-based learning opportunity really requires an important set of skills beyond just simply being able to manage others. So as the experts in both employer engagement and youth programming, intermediaries can help fill this gap by leading either supervisor trainings or even helping employers select appropriate supervisors to be able to manage students as part of the program. And lastly, intermediaries can support program planning and development. So determining appropriate projects and responsibilities requires understanding both the intensity and the duration of the work-based learning experience, as well as the individual needs of the youth themselves. So intermediaries can help support employers in actually developing the scope of their work-based learning programs. So just to summarize some of the key roles and services that employers can serve. First, just recruiting students and being able to match them to relevant work-based learning experiences. Second, managing relationships that employers have with their partners. Next, helping employers overcome some of the liability issues that they may encounter by serving as the official employer of record, supporting supervisor selection and providing training for being able to manage youth, and then lastly, designing the actual programs themselves and supporting development of those apprenticeship opportunities. Next, intermediaries serve a couple different functions for education institutions. As Ryan mentioned, that can be either in K-12 or in higher education. The first is employer recruitment and program scale. So first, just as they support employers with recruiting students, intermediaries can also support schools with recruiting employers and helping them to scale their programs. While some state agencies, districts, and even individual schools may have work-based learning coordinators who traditionally would serve this role, many still rely on those individual teachers or counselors to find opportunities for students to engage in apprenticeship programs. That might be either through, again, their personal connections or professional networks. And we found that this strategy generally makes scaling really difficult and isn't particularly efficient. So intermediaries can lift this responsibility from educators' plates, and in doing so, they can provide access to many more students to have access to apprenticeship opportunities, and these programs can more readily scale. Next, intermediaries can also help map work-based learning opportunities to curriculum and standards. We know this is especially important, so beyond work-based learning, particularly important for youth apprenticeships, which combines on-the-job training with in-classroom instruction. So with intermediaries, again, being able to navigate between employers and education institutions, they're more easily able to see what those connections are between industry standards and curricular standards. And then for youth, unlike employer engagement, which all of the different intermediaries that we interviewed engaged in, the level of engagement that we saw intermediaries have with students really varied, considering either the program type or the scope of the services that the intermediary provided. But for those who did engage with students, a key service that they offered was interview and job readiness preparation. So a work-based learning experience or an apprenticeship experience may be the first professional experience for many of these youth. So before they can apply the kind of academic and technical expertise that they gained in the classroom, many of these students must demonstrate the professional skills that they would need in any job. And those include things like resume and cover letter writing, interviewing, professional dress and communication, or really any other kind of rules of office or workplace etiquette. And though more and more schools are beginning to embed employability skills curriculum, particularly for schools or districts that have clear kind of career pathways or other aligned courses, many are relying on intermediaries to be able to provide those services for their students. And then the next one, as Ryan mentioned, I think this is where we really saw intermediaries play an important role for students, was around case management and performance monitoring. So while some programs may rely on, again, either school-based instructors for these career pathway courses or work-based learning coordinators or apprenticeship coordinators to oversee the daily activities and performance of their students. Others provide kind of in-house case management services and actually regularly conduct check-ins with students and their supervisors to be able to check their progress and assist with any challenges that may arise over the course of the apprenticeship. So again, there are a few different roles or services that we found were relevant kind of across these three stakeholder groups. So intermediaries are providing kind of accountability, administrative oversight, and communications and marketing kind of across employers and education institutions. So for accountability, we know that K-12 and higher education institutions and systems often have their own accountability structures, but intermediaries can play a really important role in holding their apprenticeship partners accountable for their respective responsibilities. Many intermediaries set either specific program requirements for the work and are responsible for ensuring that each of their partners adhere to those expectations. Additionally, the siloed nature of K-12, higher ed, and workforce data systems or accountability processes often means that there's usually not one single entity that's responsible for monitoring progress. So as a result, we found that many of the intermediaries kind of tracked outcomes for these apprenticeship programs for their own purposes. They also worked to support their partners in defining what data they needed to collect, how they were going to collect it, so establishing processes for sharing that information. We saw several intermediaries also built actual dashboards to be able to share progress across all of their partners. Next is administrative oversight. So as you can imagine, in juggling several of the different stakeholder groups, intermediaries frequently handle a lot of paperwork. This takes an important kind of time-consuming lift off of the plates of both employers and educators. But again, it's important to note that it requires significant capacity on behalf of the intermediate organization. And lastly is communications and marketing. So simply put, intermediaries communicate with multiple stakeholders who may not otherwise be connected. So as entities that speak the language of both employers and of educators, intermediaries also have a really unique ability to tailor messaging to appeal to distinct audiences. And I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren. And I think on that last note, it's critical really to think about the way in which communications changes over time based on the sort of place a particular organization is in the lifespan of developing, launching, and scaling a youth apprenticeship opportunity or program. And we really, I think the communications piece and the accountability piece sort of led us down the path of trying to look at this this issue of the role that intermediaries play from two different lenses, and that was the first was sort of if you were a location that was trying to start something new, and really what would be some of the critical elements to consider when launching an intermediary with a focus on youth apprenticeship versus a place that already had an intermediary that possibly was doing work in the adult space or otherwise, and what it would take to actually scale that in a meaningful way with a focus on youth. So the first really we want to talk about is, this is our octopus image of thinking about key considerations for launching. And these all come from lessons from each of the individual organizations that we interviewed. We asked them sort of, if you were to zoom back to the start and give yourself some advice back when you were starting, what would that advice look like? So this is not a necessarily a kind of linear process, but it's just a suggestion, a series of suggestions for where to be cautious as you're getting into this work. So ultimately, a high quality apprenticeship model is really different than other models of youth-centered work-based learning, in both in its intensity and depth. And so it requires a lot more content expertise and coordination than running things like a summer internship program. And it has a much more meaningful connection directly with post-secondary as well. So it needs to be an intermediary, needs to have the capacity really to understand the industry needs, understand the intricacies of post-secondary enrollment and articulation, and understand the ability or understand the needs of students and families to really see themselves as and see youth apprenticeship as an opportunity for advancement. And so given all of that, the first real recommendation that we received when we were sort of talking and asking about what would you do if you were to start a new program is how critical it is to really start small. That at the end of the day, every one of these institutions and organizations that we interviewed came into the equation with a clarity and definition of a particular audience they were trying to serve, whether that was a district or multiple districts, and particular industry fields. For example, when we talked to the folks in Colorado, they urged probably some of the most caution in saying they tried to boil the ocean and wanted to start with 5 different fields and started doing work both in Denver and in the Front Range, because they just had the desire to really get the work moving as quickly as possible. But that led to all sorts of challenges. And if they were to go back and do it again, really recommend that you have a kind of narrow focus on the particular pilot program that you're trying to start, and then you can work out some of the kinks before you start to scale that. Relatedly, the geographic scale is definitely connected to that. If you were a statewide intermediary, ideally you would start with a pilot in one location or 2 if they're near each other. But extending beyond that really could place some serious capacity and resource constraints that may hinder long-term success. Third is and I know everyone on this call knows this, but just the critical role of partners and champions are in making sure this work is successful. And it often takes years to build the appropriate relationships and trust for organizations to establish themselves as a critical partner. And it's important that is done so as something that you can't rush into. And you've got to really build those external champions for the need for this or for the role of an intermediary to exist and for the particular institution to play that role. That is without those partners and without those champions, organizations will not be successful. Funding comes up, of course, over and over, particularly at the beginning. There may be individual employer partners that may not want to contribute their own time or their funding in terms of employing youth if they don't see a clear return on investment or a clear sustainability process. And obviously, philanthropic dollars are great as a starting point, but they cannot, maintain the program long term. So it's critical that you have those champions that are able, and some of those early pilots and early employer commitments that are able to commit to funding that goes beyond sort of a narrow time frame, and really connected to that, developing a strong communication strategy that frames the role of youth apprenticeship as a talent development strategy, and connects it to return on investment for employers rather than just as a corporate social responsibility type engagement. One of the clearest benefits in using an intermediary is sort of being able to offer consistency at scale across different domains, across different fields, districts, et cetera. But at the same time, while consistency may be the goal, it's important to remember that no 2 employers or no 2 industries are alike. And so you have to be flexible and really being able to determine what the core principles of the program are that cannot be compromised, and then tailoring those principles and sort of the rest of the work to individual employers, individual schools, and districts. It's critical that, of course, that there's consideration given to specific industry limitations, given different safety standards and age restrictions. And that is really, I think, a decision point that often gets lost in the shuffle is really determining the extent to which high quality opportunities are available if there are specific restrictions in place in a way that's equitable for all students. Infrastructure is very important. Individual intermediary infrastructure, if you're going to do something like offer an online marketplace for matching employers and potential apprentices, what technology or platforms do you already have in place? What will it take to build those? What's the level of capacity that you're going to need to create to offer that in a way that is, you're going to have staff time devoted to making sure that it stays online and up to date. So it requires investment internally as well, rather than just externally focused in making those partnerships. And then finally, I think the last recommendation was that it's really critical that any organization starting new kind of maps out their needed capacity for success over time. And that means not just mapping out sort of training plans for both sides of employers and educators in terms of the work that needs to be happening, but also the capacity internal to the organization to enable it to continue to support the engagements across the education and employers. On the flip side, I think we heard some of the same challenges, but slightly different lenses on challenges and opportunities when talking about an intermediate, taking youth apprentice programs to scale. And the kind of four big areas or big challenges and opportunities for doing that were around funding, recruitment, the scope of the work, and then ultimately programming. So with respect to funding, regardless of the intermediary size or type of programming offered, everyone we talked to said funding is the number one issue, number one challenge when considering program growth. It's frequently an issue with covering intermediary staff and overhead, an issue with curriculum development, and certainly from time to time there are issues in terms of employers and being able to pay kind of for student wages. I think the advice that we got over time really was about the importance of selling and helping employers understand how this work is a talent development strategy, and that they're much more likely, if you can convince HR of the value over time, rather than just sort of pitching this as a sort of one-off type of approach or type of engagement. So that continues to be an issue. I don't think any of the intermediaries we talked about have solved the funding issue. There are different approaches. Some have asked for specific state financing. Some have tried to recoup, individual business tax dollars and reinvest that into some of the work. Others take more of a kind of partnership model, and that employers that are engaged in this work are paying in funding to be able to support it. Others, there is, if it's based out of a chamber of commerce or a community college, there's additional finance and investment that they're using, kind of multiple avenues of either employer commitments or individual federal or state funding streams to support Unfortunately, there's no single answer on this one. With respect to recruitment, employer recruitment and investment is its own challenge, but it's also, as we were talking about, could be a solution. So what we heard from most of the intermediaries, that the crux of the challenge is really about framing the benefit that employers receive by participating. As I mentioned, there may be some motivation to participate via sort of the corporate social responsibility aspects, but really at the end of the day, it's about seeing a positive return on investment for their bottom line. And youth apprenticeships as long-term and intensive commitments are particularly suited for this framing. Indeed, many of the intermediaries actually market youth apprenticeship, as I mentioned, as a talent development strategy, and have been able to show the commitment that students that start in youth apprenticeships ultimately deliver long-term talent, whether that means continuing on to an apprenticeship program or going directly into work after completing that program. Intermediaries face unique challenges in growing, sustaining scale programs at scale as well, based on kind of scope and different program types. And I think what we heard was that the challenges are unique in recognizing that no two communities kind of have the same needs, and really building that flexibility to be able to operate some core functions while having a second side of the house that is able to partner and understand the unique areas, unique needs of the particular area. So creating capacity internally to sort of create consistent service models, but then finding ways, a second set of capacity to serve as individual kind of individual consultants or individual engagement managers, both with employers and students and education institutions, to make it work for them. It requires having a sort of variety of capacity internally to do both of those things. And recognizing that there may be specific roles that a particular intermediary serves well, but other roles that they may not be able to serve that well, and looking for opportunities to partner so that scale can be increased. And then finally, on the programming side, as you guys all know, youth apprenticeship is highly intensive and requires significant time commitment. Employers have to agree to more demanding and longer term supervision, and youth generally need to meet more kind of rigorous academic, technical, and professional prerequisites to participate. So what that means is that building and sustaining high quality programming requires significantly more effort than just finding and filling a large number of kind of site visits or job shadowing programs. So what we heard pretty consistently from each of the partners is that as a result, they have really tried to slow down the development of programming and not try to rush into something, both from a start small perspective, but also recognition that scale often is easier in fields that you already currently are working. So it's certainly easier to add individual students if you're already focused on advanced manufacturing than it is to go off and start a new aerospace youth apprenticeship model in a different field. And that from their perspectives, you're often looking at 12, 18, 24 months, possibly even, to lift up programs in new fields. Because you have to spend time building the coalition of champions and recruiting employers and getting funding and all of that in order. So what we heard from many of the places that we talked about was a concerted effort to scale first within the industries that they know, and then over time slowly add on other fields, but not to do so too many at a time. So maybe it's one every year you're adding a new industry or field, rather than trying to serve everybody all at the same time. So that's a summary of some of the interviews and engagement that we had and we have had across the country in this work. Obviously, it's a very quick capture of some of the lessons, and our paper gives much more detailed examples of individual organizations and how they handled some of these different roles. But would love to see if there are any questions that you have about what we found or any insights that we can offer to help make your work more impactful. And we would offer you to please feel free to use the chat function on Zoom to share any questions or comments that you have. So we received a first question from around public funding that intermediaries have utilized. So we've seen a couple different approaches. The one from Rhode Island was one I mentioned previously, where they they actually capture a portion of the business tax and reinvest that in their statewide intermediary, Prepare Rhode Island. And there have been others that use kind of when local workforce boards serve as that role, have used be it either Perkins dollars or WIOA funding to be able to invest some of their time and efforts in starting programs and scaling programs, as long as they're connected to sort of career pathways. And then you've also seen in places like Colorado and Washington and others, where individual states legislatures have invested some startup funds to be able to support some of the networking that happens at a statewide level. I'm just trying to scroll up. Another question, did you have any individual high schools working as the intermediaries? So this is a interesting question, one that we sort of posed to ourselves, the kind of role that an individual institution could play. And we've seen some of that happen, for instance, in Ohio, that there are certain career centers, technical and career centers that serve their own role as an intermediary. Our perspective on this is that while that's certainly something that can be done, that we wouldn't advise it necessarily, because we think that the role and the capacity it takes to be highly successful at navigating relationships with multiple employers across multiple fields and is valuable from a regional perspective, from a kind of broader than a single high school. So just as you wouldn't want to create a scenario where in a district that has 5 high schools, that each of those individual high schools is going to the same employers every single, and trying to create their own programs. It would be a nightmare for employers to handle, and it's sort of duplicative in a way that isn't helpful for individual students. So like I said, the sort of concept of the intermediary is really about being a force multiplier that can have a broader vision and view beyond just a single high school. So a question about, you gave us pause to be cautious when we are starting up. However, I wonder if being ambitious helped the intermediaries get to where they are. How do you balance this? That's a great question. One that I think, if you ask some communities like a Colorado, sort of were you successful because of your ambition, or were you successful because of your caution? I think they would tell you yes, both. So if you have the will and the sort of political capital and support, of course you want to maximize and leverage that as much as you possibly can. That being said, even, you know, if Ryan Gensler from CareerWise was on this conversation, and we've had him in other meetings and presentations, even he says they were, everything that they heard from their visits to Europe was, don't try to do too much too fast. And they did, and they suffered a little bit because of it. They tried to do 2 different locations at the same time, and it caused a lot of capacity strain for them. So I think it's about determining what the opportunity is, and determining where you can move fast and be ambitious, and where you should be narrow and cautious. So my gut on this says, be ambitious about, you know, the number of students potentially, but be cautious about the number of fields, and the number of employers, because it takes time to build those relationships and to really have the trust of employers across multiple different fields. There was a question on the Q&A that says, do you have statistics you can share about retention of youth apprenticeships so that we can share with businesses? Would be for the purpose of ROI. Yes, that is certainly something that we can get to you. So I know that's something that the PAYA partners are trying to begin to collect and create sort of a toolkit, a communications toolkit, if you will. So we will go back and ask our partners to be able to share some of those statistics and share that out with the network. Did you find any intermediaries that play a role in helping interns or apprentices secure industry recognized credentials? Yes and no. So yes, we did find that. Oftentimes it was in connection to the broader career pathways work that was happening within a particular district or with a post-secondary institution. So helping to identify which of the quality credentials a student should take for which particular role or field that they were going into is something that many of the intermediaries did. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were encouraging or supporting students to take those assessments outside of pathways within their high school. So really working to make sure that the learning that's happening in the classroom is paired with the work-based learning experience outside of the classroom, and that students have the appropriate credentials to be able to be successful in those positions. What kind of scale are these programs reaching in terms of students and employer reach? So this is a little bit all over the map. So for the folks that we talked to, they were everywhere from, we have 20 youth apprentices in X place to AJC, the aerospace one, is statewide in Washington. CareerWise has a couple hundred across the state. GPS, Education Partners, is starting to go regionally and actually expand to statewide. German American Chamber of Commerce has actually a number of sites, I think 4 or 5 sites now, across a handful of states. Trident Technical has got, at this point, probably close to 1,000 students that they've somehow engaged in their programs. And the employer connections vary quite considerably depending on whether something is local in scope or statewide or national in scope. So whether that's in a particular industry or field, it may be 20 companies across a statewide experience, it may be in the hundreds. So I know CareerWise is in the hundreds in terms of employers that are engaged. Your model is very hands-on and well suited to local intermediaries. Do state intermediaries coordinate with local intermediaries? Actually, so we, this I think gets a little bit to the sort of off the cuff comment I made about the notion of an intermediary of intermediaries, which is I think what you're offering here in terms of an individual organization that works with multiple local organizations. We found actually both. So we did find some state-based intermediaries that serve in that kind of role, and they're probably looser in the sense of the types of things that they do, but they may be really important for setting up kind of data infrastructure. They may be important for setting up that kind of technology platform that folks can use to connect students and employers. That's something that the Indiana statewide chamber is doing. They're creating the platform, and then others are kind of able to use it. But we did see also there are a few state intermediaries that actually provide direct matches and student kind of connections, and that's what Prepare Rhode Island does. And so there's different forms and fashions on that. Of the intermediaries that you surveyed, how many charge a fee to employers or are compensated financially in some way by the partners for the work they do? Almost all of them do expect employers to contribute in some form or fashion, certainly in terms of paying students, but many of them do also have an employer contribution for the function or the functions that intermediaries are offering. So for folks that are interested, yes, our report is posted online. If you go to the PAYA website, there's a resources section, which you can find that, as well as if you go to edstrategy.org in our resources section, you can find the report as well. When more than one intermediary was active in a region, did you learn anything about how they are coordinating or not? That's a good question. Let me think. So maybe Indiana and Ivy Tech is probably the best immediate answer that comes to mind. So like I said, the chamber in Indiana is responsible for creating the platform for it's called Employee IN, for the platform for connecting youth apprentices, and really it's even broader than that for them. It's internships as well with individual employers. They are connected and engaged with Ivy Tech at a statewide level. And then locally, Kokomo is creating their own youth apprenticeship program, of which they are trying to tap into some of those employer connections that have already been made. I don't know that we dug deep enough to know, are there specific areas where they are either collaborating or not, but it's certainly something that we can and probably should follow up on. So thank you for asking that question. Someone asked about whether any of these examples are in rural areas. Yes, the AJAC operates in rural parts of Washington. CareerWise, the Front Range in Colorado has engagement. There's GPS Education Partners is in kind of outside of the urban areas in Wisconsin. Horizon Education Alliance is in sort of semi-rural area of Indiana as well. So yes, some of these are examples in rural, and I think you can, I think many of the issues that that we talked about in terms of scale and capacity and funding are only amplified when it comes in the rural space. I think maybe GPS is probably the best direct answer or example here, where just as a kind of point that I've reiterated a couple times, they recognize that they're sort of focused on advanced manufacturing. They came out of an individual company that was looking for help with their talent pipeline, and they engaged other advanced manufacturers in the region, even though it is a sort of rural area. That is the one of the things that they have in that kind of center, the area of Wisconsin that they're operating, is there are a couple companies that are focused on advanced manufacturing, and so they partnered together to target that as opportunities for local school districts across multiple districts in their region, and really sold that as a kind of a sector strategy for really promoting the work that they're doing individually and collectively, and for giving more youth opportunities to kind of earn and gain that post-secondary experience and that work experience that ultimately could help lead them to earning a post-secondary credential. So our organization is somewhat unique in that we're intentionally placing students from disadvantaged backgrounds, typically not the strongest students. Are there examples like that? One example that I know from my experience in Delaware is that we actually created and tried to pair a academic recovery and advancement course with students participating in high quality work-based learning and specifically youth apprenticeship. So there was, and this was done in collaboration with the community college system in the state, the community and technical college system, created both a 12th grade math and ELA course that would allow students to demonstrate college readiness through successful completion of that course, that would enable them then to be able to access the necessary dual credit that came along with the youth apprenticeship opportunities that we were offering. So trying to partner at an institution and educational level to offer the sort of academic support necessary for students to be able to meet the requirements that were in place in our state in terms of accessing early post-secondary credit was one example. And in Delaware, the community and technical college actually serves as the intermediary for that work. And so that was why that partnership existed. There are other examples in the PAYA network. For instance, in the Twin Cities area, they're working to try to expand youth apprenticeship opportunities for opportunity youth and sort of re-engaging those students first and foremost into the education sector, and then getting them connected and linked up with workforce opportunities. So that may be another place that we can connect you with the work that they're doing in the Twin Cities. Do you have examples of regional intermediaries coordinating with other intermediaries operating at the local level? I'd probably have to learn more, and this is probably similar to the question about the sort of state versus local. I'd probably have to learn more a little bit about what the coordination intent is, in terms of, is that about coordinating placement with students, coordinating outreach to employers? I mean, certainly part of what some of the statewide organizations have done, like Apprenticeship Carolina and CareerWise Colorado, and certainly Career Connect in Washington, is to build out common communications and sort of talking points and engagement, and try to build the desire and interest in youth apprenticeship writ large across the state, and then have fed that information down to local organizations that are serving more in the direct to student or employer engagement, and really kind of thought of themselves as a producer of information, as a back office support for others to do the work, the direct program work. And so that's probably the most or the clearest example of that coordination that we've seen in our work. But I'm sure there are other examples that, you know, we're more than happy to think through or expand upon if you have specific questions about how to do that. All right, well, thank you guys all for being an engaged audience. I know that Joyce wanted to share some more information about where the network is going next, and I would just encourage you to continue to reach out to us and through the PAYA network if you have questions or want to engage further about this issue. And would encourage you as well to go and read download the report directly. And I saw that someone posted that to the chat, that link to the chat. So appreciate whoever did that for us. Thanks.
All right, thank you, ESG, for all of your work putting this report together and for sharing your findings with everyone. Before we end the call, I know we've gone a little over an hour now. We wanted to make some PAYA network announcements so that you all know about some events that are coming up. The first is the next PAYA webinar or monthly network learning opportunity for February. It will be on February 20th at 1 p.m., which is back to the usual third Thursday of every month at 1 p.m. And this one will be hosted by our partners at JFF, and they'll be presenting on the self-assessment program development tool that they put together for as a PAYA partner. And they'll walk you through how to use that and how that can be best deployed to be helpful for all of your programs. And then there are 3 sort of deep dive opportunities that are coming up that are open to all PAYA network members. The first one is a CareerWise National Summit, and that will give you a closer look at the CareerWise Colorado model, which now exists in places outside of just Colorado. And that will happen from February 27th to 28th in Denver. And then similarly, our other partners at Charleston Regional Youth Apprenticeship Program will be hosting a similar learning tour of their program in South Carolina from March 30th through 31st. And if you are interested at all in attending, please shoot me an email. We're beginning to compile a list of folks who are interested and want to be sure to connect all of you to our respective partners so that you can go and learn more. And then finally, we have an opportunity for you to go to Germany to get a better sense of the model that exists out there. This is an application process which closes in mid-March. However, and apparently this is not clear the first time, this is an all expenses paid 2-week tour of Germany and their youth apprenticeship programs for your team. We sent around a PDF that has application instructions in an earlier email, but if you did not receive that or want to ask any questions about it, please email Taylor White. Her email is up there, or also me, and I can send you that document as well. And then we all wanted to share with you some links to our partners' resources. I know that someone had asked about ESGs. I think I might have left them off this one because I had assumed that you had already seen theirs, but I will add that one to this list and then send out this slide deck and a recording so that you can have links to all of our partner resources, which hopefully will be very helpful to your work. And we have one more upcoming from our partners at National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity about equity in youth apprenticeships. So hopefully all of that is helpful to you. Thank you all for joining. I know we went a little over an hour, and thank you to ESG for your presentation today. Look out for more updates or emails from us about the PAYA network, and we're excited to connect with all of you, hopefully at any opportunities. Bye.